The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the vast, sprawling fields that bordered the town of Millstone. In the distance, the quaint cottages of the town seemed peaceful, even idyllic, completely at odds with the storm brewing within the heart of one of its wealthiest residents. Mr. Harrison, a man known for his powerful presence and commanding voice, stood at the gates of the modest home of Daniel, the mute shepherd. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightened with the fury of a man who had been betrayed. A lifetime of control, of authority, of maintaining order had been undone in an instant by one single act. His only daughter, Emily, had married Daniel, a man with no wealth, no status, and the most unsettling of all traits, his silence. And to make matters worse, she had done so out of spite. Emily Harrison, the only daughter of one of the town's wealthiest and most respected families, had always been a picture of poise, grace, and beauty. Her father, Mr. Harrison, had made sure of it. From an early age, Emily had been groomed to carry the legacy of their family. She had been taught the ways of high society, trained in the arts of conversation and etiquette, and educated in all things that would ensure her place at the top of the social hierarchy. Nothing had ever been out of her reach. She was a diamond in the rough, a jewel of sophistication and charm, and her father had planned her life with meticulous care. He had never imagined that one day she would choose to defy him in such a radical, unforgivable way. Daniel, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He was a man of few words, his silence only deepening the mystery that surrounded him. He was a shepherd, living on the outskirts of the town in a small, unassuming cabin that was worlds apart from the grandeur of the Harrison estate. His life had been simple, defined by the routine of caring for his flock and the quiet solitude that came with his work. Yet there was something about him that drew Emily in, something that her father would never understand, something that made her question the very world she had been born into. It wasn't as if Emily hadn't had her share of suitors. The town was filled with eligible men, each one eager to win her hand in marriage. But none of them ever truly captivated her. They were polite, well-mannered, and presented themselves as the perfect candidates for a future tied to wealth and status. Yet, Emily couldn't bring herself to love them. They were all so predictable. Everything in her life had been decided for her, her schooling, her career, her future, but with Daniel, everything was different. He wasn't concerned with her wealth or her name. He didn't care about impressing her father or fitting into the social circles that Emily had been born into. He simply saw her as she was, and that was enough for him. It was this very simplicity that had pulled her toward him. At first, it had been nothing more than a quiet connection, small conversations shared while he tended to his sheep, stolen moments when her mind craved something beyond the suffocating expectations of her family. Daniel never pushed her to explain herself or conform to the ideals that surrounded her. He allowed her to simply be, and for the first time in her life, Emily felt free. But her father, Mr. Harrison, would never understand. He had spent his life building an empire, ensuring his family's position in the highest echelons of society. For him, Emily's marriage was not just an act of defiance, it was a challenge to everything he had worked for. He had always prided himself on controlling every aspect of his daughter's life, from the clothes she wore to the men she dated. But Daniel? Daniel was a shepherd, a man of silence, someone who would never fit into the life Mr. Harrison had envisioned for Emily. He had never seen Daniel as anything more than a bumpkin, unworthy, uncouth, and most certainly unfit to be his daughter's husband. The confrontation was inevitable. Mr. Harrison had tried everything to change his daughter's mind. He had offered her wealth, luxury, even trips abroad, anything to convince her to break free from her dangerous infatuation with Daniel. But nothing had worked. Emily was resolute in her decision. She would marry Daniel, and she would do so on her own terms. And so, Mr. Harrison had decided to take matters into his own hands. He had spent the entire morning preparing for the confrontation, his heart burning with anger, his mind clouded with thoughts of how to teach his daughter a lesson she would never forget. As he stood at the gates of Daniel's home, Mr. Harrison's mind raced. He had heard the rumors about Daniel, how he had grown up in a small, impoverished village before finding solace in the quiet life of a shepherd. He knew that Daniel was mute, and while he had never taken the time to understand why, it only fueled his belief that Daniel was beneath his daughter. What could this man offer her? What future could they possibly have? The tension in the air was palpable as Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path. The front door of the shepherd's cabin was ajar, but no one came to greet him. The silence was deafening. It wasn't until he reached the front door that Daniel appeared, standing there, as quiet as ever, his dark eyes fixed on Mr. Harrison. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until Mr. Harrison could bear it no longer. "You've made a terrible mistake, boy," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have no place in this world, and you certainly have no place in my daughter's life. She deserves better than you. I don't know what she sees in you, but I intend to put an end to this madness." Daniel's expression remained unchanged, his eyes never leaving Mr. Harrison's. He said nothing, not a single word, but there was something in the way he stood, something that made Mr. Harrison's fury flare even brighter. "I won't let you ruin her future," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice rising. "She has everything she could ever need, and you offer her nothing. You are nothing. A mute shepherd, living in this dump. What are you going to do for her? Provide her with silence and sheep?" Daniel's gaze softened ever so slightly, but he still remained silent, his posture calm, unshaken by Mr. Harrison's tirade. In that moment, something inside Mr. Harrison snapped. He had expected the shepherd to cower, to beg for mercy. He had expected Daniel to apologize, to confess his inadequacy. But instead, Daniel stood firm, a silent force of nature. And that defiance infuriated Mr. Harrison more than anything else. "You think you can just take her away from me? From everything I've built? You think you're worthy of her?" Mr. Harrison shouted. "She's mine. She's my daughter. And you?" He was cut off by the soft, steady voice that came from Daniel's lips, surprising both him and Emily, who had stepped out of the house to witness the scene. Daniel's voice wasn't loud, nor was it angry. It was simple, calm, and filled with a wisdom that Mr. Harrison had never expected to hear from a man who had said nothing for so long. "Love," Daniel said, his voice steady and clear, "is not measured by wealth or status. It is found in understanding, in patience, and in silence. I have given her all I have, my heart, my devotion, my silence. I have no riches, no power, but I offer her something far more precious, truth." The words hit Mr. Harrison like a slap to the face. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about life, about love, and about his daughter's marriage shattered. The shepherd's silence, the one thing that had caused him to dismiss Daniel as insignificant, now became his strength. And it was in that moment, standing there on the doorstep of the shepherd's humble home, that Mr. Harrison realized, perhaps too late, that he had underestimated both Emily and Daniel in ways he could never have imagined. As he stood there, speechless, Emily watched her father, the man who had ruled her life with an iron fist, now defeated by a man who had never said a word. And that was only the beginning. The weight of that moment hung in the air long after Daniel had spoken. For Emily, standing just behind Daniel, it was as if the entire world had paused. She had always known that her father was powerful, but she had never fully realized how deeply his control extended over everything she did. And now, in front of her, the man who had ruled her life with an unspoken tyranny was crumbling, not because of some physical act of defiance, but because of Daniel's simple, yet profound, words. Her heart pounded in her chest, not out of fear, but out of something she couldn't quite name. She had always been her father's princess, a woman protected and provided for in every way, but for the first time in her life, she realized she no longer wanted that life. She didn't want to be a trophy in a gilded cage, adorned with riches but never truly free. She wanted something real. And Daniel had given her that something real. He had given her silence, and within that silence, a truth she couldn't deny. Emily's eyes remained locked on Daniel as her father fumed beside her, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. She could see the storm brewing within him, his pride, wounded beyond recognition, and his anger, now rising to a boiling point. He had come here, prepared for a battle, certain he could crush this man's spirit, but the unspoken battle between them had taken an unexpected turn. It was a battle not of words, not of power or wealth, but of emotions too deep to articulate. And Daniel had won that battle in an instant, simply by being himself. "Emily, don't be a fool," her father finally said, his voice trembling with rage. "What are you thinking? This man is beneath you, beneath everything we've worked for. You're throwing your future away, your family's legacy, all for what? A man who can't even speak. A man who's too weak to stand up for himself." His words stung, but Emily's resolve only strengthened. "I'm not throwing anything away, father," Emily said, her voice steady, calm, but full of conviction. "I'm choosing something for myself. Something real. Daniel doesn't need to speak to make me feel loved. He doesn't need riches or status to prove his worth. His silence has taught me more than all the wealth you've given me. And you," she took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering, "you've taught me to be afraid of the world, to be afraid of living a life that's anything but perfect. But I don't want that anymore. I want freedom, not from you, but from the life you've forced on me." Her father's eyes widened as if he couldn't comprehend the words coming from his daughter. He had never imagined that she would choose a life of simplicity, let alone with a man he considered unworthy. In his mind, Emily's choice was an insult not only to him but to everything he had built. He had always believed that love, true love, was tied to material success, to power, to lineage. It was how things were done in his world. But Daniel's quiet demeanor had completely upended his worldview. His daughter had become a stranger to him in that moment, and he couldn't understand how someone who had been shaped by his hands could so completely defy everything he had taught her. "Emily, I don't know who you've become, but this isn't you," Mr. Harrison said, his voice shaking with frustration. "You're going to ruin your life. Do you really want to live like this? Do you really want to live in a shack, with a man who can't even speak?" His voice grew louder with each word, but Emily didn't flinch. She had heard these kinds of words all her life, and now they no longer held power over her. The threat of disownment, the promise of losing everything, it no longer mattered. Daniel had given her something far more valuable than any of that. "I'm not ruining my life, father. I'm finally living it," Emily said quietly, her voice no longer filled with anger, but with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her very being. She turned toward Daniel then, taking his hand into hers, feeling the warmth of his touch. In that simple act, she felt something that words could never capture, something profound, something that told her this was where she was meant to be. Daniel stood still, his gaze never leaving Emily's father. His silence, once seen as a weakness, now held a kind of strength that Mr. Harrison couldn't understand. The shepherd's past, shrouded in mystery, was a quiet testament to the man Daniel had become. He had never spoken of his past, nor had Emily ever asked. But now, in this moment, the truth of who he was stood clear before her father. Daniel's silence wasn't a barrier, it was his strength, his resilience. It was a reflection of everything he had endured in his life. And now, that strength was what Emily needed. She could no longer be the fragile, delicate thing her father had raised her to be. She had chosen the path of independence, the path of authenticity, and Daniel was the one who had shown her how to find it. Mr. Harrison's eyes darted from Daniel to Emily, disbelief written across his face. How could this have happened? How could his daughter, his precious, well-bred daughter, choose this life? He had given her everything. He had provided her with the best schools, the finest clothes, the most exquisite parties. He had built an empire, and in his mind, that empire was meant to secure Emily's future, to ensure she never had to make the difficult choices he had made in his own youth. But Emily was no longer the girl he had raised. She had become someone else, someone he could no longer control. "You'll regret this," Mr. Harrison spat, the anger in his voice growing with each word. "You'll see. You'll realize just how foolish you've been." He turned to leave, his steps heavy with the weight of his defeat. But just before he reached the gate, Emily called out to him, her voice calm but resolute. "Maybe I will, Father. But I'll never regret the decision to live my own life." Her words hung in the air, ringing with a finality that left no room for argument. Mr. Harrison hesitated, his hand on the gate, but he didn't turn back. He knew, deep down, that there was nothing more to be said. Emily had made her choice, and that choice had shattered everything he had believed about her. The man who had once been the unquestioned ruler of his family now found himself powerless in the face of a decision he could not control. He had failed to understand his daughter, and now, he would have to live with the consequences. As the gate swung closed behind him, Emily turned back to Daniel, her heart swelling with emotion. She had done it. She had stood up to her father, and for the first time in her life, she felt as though she had reclaimed her own identity. She wasn't just a daughter of a wealthy man anymore. She wasn't defined by the expectations that had been thrust upon her. She was Emily, a woman with her own mind, her own heart, and her own future. Daniel, standing beside her, said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The bond they shared didn't need words to be understood. In that moment, everything else fell away. The tension, the anger, the pain, they all seemed distant, as though they belonged to another world, one that Emily was now free from. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly alive. The days following that confrontation were a blur of emotions for Emily. The moment her father had walked away, leaving her standing at Daniel's side, something had shifted deep within her. The freedom she had longed for was no longer a distant dream, but a reality that she had to face. The path she had chosen was not one of ease, she knew that. She had abandoned the comfort of her father's riches, the security of his influence, and the life that had been planned for her. And while part of her felt a surge of exhilaration at having made the decision for herself, another part of her wondered if she had made a mistake. Would she really be able to live without the support and luxury that she had grown accustomed to? Would Daniel's silent strength be enough to see them through? But as the days turned into weeks, Emily's fears slowly began to fade. The reality of her choice settled into her bones, and with it, a new understanding of what it meant to truly live. The small cottage that Daniel called home was nothing like the grand estate she had left behind. It was humble, nestled against the vast fields where Daniel's sheep grazed, a world apart from the glittering lights of the town. But to Emily, it was perfect. She woke each morning to the sound of birds singing outside the window, the soft bleating of the sheep in the distance, and the scent of fresh bread baking in the oven. It wasn't the life she had been raised to expect, but it was a life filled with authenticity, something that had been missing from her world for so long. The quietness of their life together became its own kind of music. Daniel never pressured her to speak, never forced her to fill the silence that hung between them. In fact, it seemed as though he reveled in it, in the space between words, the space that allowed both of them to simply be. And it was in that silence that Emily began to hear herself in ways she never had before. For the first time, she could hear her own heart, her own thoughts, without the constant clamor of her father's expectations, the noise of high society, and the hum of a life built on superficiality. But Emily's new life was not without its challenges. There were moments when doubt crept into her mind, when she would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had truly made the right decision. The whispers from town grew louder, filled with curiosity, gossip, and judgment. They called her crazy, reckless, and naive. The town had known her as the poised and elegant daughter of Mr. Harrison, the wealthy businessman who seemed to have a hand in everything. To them, her marriage to Daniel, a mute shepherd, was incomprehensible. They couldn't understand why she would choose a life of hardship when she could have everything she had ever wanted. One afternoon, while she was out in the garden, Emily overheard a conversation between two of the town's women who had once been her friends. Their voices drifted over the fence as they talked in hushed tones, assuming she couldn't hear them. "Did you hear?" one woman said. "She's living with him, a shepherd, no less. I can't believe it. What was she thinking?" Another voice chimed in, colder and more judgmental. "She's thrown away everything. All that wealth, all that status, for a man who can't even speak. I heard he's mute. How could she do that to herself?" Emily felt the sting of their words, though she knew they were speaking out of ignorance. She had once lived for their approval, for the status that came with being the daughter of Mr. Harrison. But now, as she listened to their words, she realized how little their opinions mattered. They didn't know Daniel. They didn't understand him. And they certainly didn't know her. Despite the town's whispers, Emily found comfort in the stillness of her new life. She learned how to cook meals with her own hands, how to mend clothes, and how to care for the small garden that bloomed outside their cottage. Daniel taught her how to tend to the sheep, his silent guidance helping her understand the rhythms of the land. The days passed quietly, filled with small moments of happiness, moments that were richer and more meaningful than anything she had known before. There was no rushing, no pretense, no performance. There was just the two of them, living in the present, building a life based on their own terms. But just when Emily began to feel like she had found her place, the past came crashing back into her life. One fateful morning, as Emily and Daniel were out tending to the flock, they heard the rumble of a car approaching. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was rare for anyone from the town to visit, and rarer still for someone to make the journey all the way to the outskirts where Daniel's home stood. The car pulled up to the edge of their property, and Emily immediately recognized it, her father's sleek black sedan. Her stomach churned as the figure of her father emerged from the vehicle, his face as stern and implacable as ever. Daniel stood beside her, sensing the tension in the air, though he said nothing. Emily took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment she knew would eventually come. Her father had come to make his final attempt at winning her back, to tear her away from the life she had chosen. "Emily," her father called, his voice cold and commanding as he approached them. "I've given you enough time to make your decision. But this is absurd. You've ruined your future, and now you're living like this, like some common peasant." Emily's heart clenched. Her father's words still held a certain power over her, but she would not let them control her any longer. She stood tall, refusing to let him see the weakness he so often tried to exploit. "I'm not living like a peasant, father. I'm living my life. The life I've chosen. I don't need your wealth, and I don't need your approval." Her father's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Emily saw something akin to pain flicker across his face, but it was quickly replaced by anger. He had never been one to show vulnerability, especially not in front of someone he considered beneath him. "You don't understand, do you?" he spat, his voice rising. "You've made a fool of yourself. You've thrown away everything for a man who can't even speak. What future is there for you in this?" He gestured to the humble cottage, to the fields that stretched out in every direction. "This is not the life I wanted for you. I gave you everything. I gave you opportunity. And you've thrown it all away." Emily's gaze softened as she looked at her father, but her resolve did not waver. "No, father. You gave me a life you wanted for me, not the life I wanted for myself. And I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finally living the way I've always dreamed of." Daniel, standing silently at her side, placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support. Emily felt his steady presence, his quiet strength, and it reminded her of everything she had come to value. Her father's face turned red with frustration, his fists clenched at his sides. "I won't stand by and watch you destroy your future," he snarled. "I'll do whatever it takes to bring you back." Emily shook her head, her heart heavy but resolute. "You can't bring me back, Father. I've already made my choice. And this is where I belong." Her father stood there, seething with anger, before turning sharply and walking back to his car. The tires screeched as he pulled away, disappearing into the distance. Emily felt the weight of his departure, but also a sense of relief. The final barrier had been broken. As she turned to Daniel, her heart ached for the father she had once known. But she also felt something new, something stronger, a sense of peace. She had chosen a life that was her own, not one dictated by anyone else's expectations. And with Daniel by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. In that moment, Emily realized that love was not about grandeur or wealth. It wasn't about status or power. Love was about choosing someone who saw you for who you truly were, someone who was willing to stand by you in silence and in strength. And in Daniel's silence, she had found the truest love of all. The days after her father's visit passed in a strange, almost surreal quietness. Emily had expected more fallout, more protests, more accusations, but there was nothing. Her father's retreat back into his world was swift, like the sting of a bee that had momentarily jabbed but then drifted away. Emily didn't know if that made her feel more triumphant or empty. The silence her father left behind was deafening. It was as if the whole world had expected her to crumble under the weight of his anger, to return to the familiar, comfortable life she had known, but Emily remained unwavering. In those moments of reflection, though, a deeper truth settled in her mind. She had not made this choice to spite her father, she had made it because she had found something in Daniel that spoke to the very core of her being. Something that no amount of wealth, prestige, or control could offer. But that didn't mean the path forward was without its obstacles. In fact, the challenges were only just beginning. While Emily had chosen to leave behind the suffocating expectations of her father, the reality of living a life free from his influence was more complicated than she had imagined. They were far from wealthy, far from the world she had once known, and the responsibilities of running the small farm became ever more apparent. What she had once viewed as an idyllic escape now seemed like an overwhelming task. There were days when Emily found herself questioning whether she could truly sustain this life she had chosen. The physical labor, the lack of luxuries, and the constant worry about making ends meet tested her resolve. It was easy to dream of a life free from her father's demands when everything was new and exciting, but when the daily grind set in, doubts began to creep into her mind. The mornings were the hardest. The early light would filter through the cracks in the wooden shutters, signaling the start of another long day. Daniel would rise before her, as always, his quiet routine of tending to the sheep and preparing the land for whatever the day required. Emily had no choice but to keep up. She had always been a woman of refinement, used to the comforts of a privileged life, but now her hands were stained with dirt, and her back ached from the long hours spent planting, cleaning, and working the land. It was a life of simple pleasures, but they were hard-won pleasures, ones that made her realize just how much she had taken for granted in her old life. It was easy to wear silk gowns and sip champagne in a lavish ballroom, but now Emily had learned to live off the land, using her hands to build, to fix, and to grow. It was a hard, unglamorous life, and it was starting to show in the way her fingers were calloused and her body was worn from the physical demands. Despite her exhaustion, though, Emily couldn't help but notice how Daniel never wavered. His silent presence remained a constant source of strength. His eyes, warm and knowing, always offered reassurance when her doubts threatened to overwhelm her. The simplicity of his ways had become a grounding force for her, reminding her that life did not need to be filled with excess or grandeur to be meaningful. The silence between them was not empty, it was filled with love, understanding, and a quiet wisdom that Emily had never realized she needed until now. And yet, there was still so much she did not know about Daniel. So much about him that was veiled in mystery, hidden behind the silence he carried so gracefully. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of work, Emily sat on the porch with a cup of tea in her hands, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the mountains. Daniel sat beside her, his presence comforting, though he said nothing. The cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of the fields and the earth. For a while, they sat in silence, enjoying the peace of the moment. But Emily could feel the unspoken question rising within her, the question that had been lingering in the back of her mind for weeks. "Daniel," she began, her voice quiet but filled with a curiosity she could no longer suppress, "I've been wondering, why don't you speak? Was there something that happened? Was it a choice you made, or was it something else?" Daniel turned toward her, his eyes soft and full of understanding. He was silent for a long moment, as if considering how to answer her question without the use of words. Then, as if speaking through his gaze, he reached out and gently cupped her hand in his touch warm and steady. He had never spoken much about his past, and Emily had never pressed him to share. But now, as she looked at him, she could see the shadows of something old and painful lurking in his eyes. With a small sigh, Daniel pulled his hand back and stood. Without a word, he walked toward the small shed at the edge of the property where he kept some of his old belongings. Emily watched him, wondering what he was doing. After a few minutes, Daniel returned, holding an old, worn journal in his hands. He handed it to her without a word, his face unreadable. Emily took the journal cautiously, flipping through its pages. The handwriting inside was neat but faded, the ink slightly smeared in places. As she read through the journal, she discovered pieces of Daniel's life she had never known. There were no details of grandeur or riches, but there were stories, painful, difficult stories, that painted a picture of a life that had been much more difficult than she had imagined. Daniel's life had been marked by tragedy. He had grown up in a small, impoverished village, where his family had struggled to survive. From an early age, he had been subjected to hardship, losing his parents to a devastating illness when he was just a teenager. After their death, Daniel had taken on the responsibility of caring for his younger siblings, all while working the land to provide for them. His struggles had been endless, and the weight of it all had eventually taken its toll on him. One day, after his youngest sibling had been taken by illness as well, Daniel had fallen silent. The grief, the pain, and the overwhelming sense of loss had left him speechless. It wasn't a conscious decision to stop speaking, but rather a gradual retreat into himself, as though his body and mind had simply shut down in the face of too much sorrow. The silence, for him, had become a protective shield, a way to block out the world that had taken so much from him. As Emily continued reading, she found a letter near the back of the journal. It was addressed to no one in particular, but it was clear from the words that it was meant for someone he had loved deeply. In the letter, Daniel poured out his heart, confessing his sorrow and his inability to express the love he had felt for that person. It was the one place where words had found their way into his life, and yet even in his written words, he had expressed his inability to speak them aloud. The letter ended with a simple statement: "I will never be able to speak the words I feel, but you must know that my silence is not a sign of indifference. It is a sign of love, one that cannot be expressed in words." As Emily read the final lines of the letter, tears welled up in her eyes. She looked up at Daniel, who stood silently in front of her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He hadn't said a word, but in that moment, Emily understood. His silence was not a punishment, nor was it something that needed to be fixed. It was simply a part of who he was, a man who had experienced loss, who had loved deeply, and who had learned to communicate through actions, not words. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I had no idea." She reached out for him, and without hesitation, he took her hand in his, offering her the silent comfort that only he could give. For the first time in their relationship, Emily understood the full depth of Daniel's silence. It was not a barrier between them, but a bridge. It was a quiet language that spoke of a love so profound that words could never capture it. And in that moment, Emily realized that she had never needed words from Daniel. What they shared went beyond anything that could be said. As the evening sun dipped lower, casting its golden glow over the fields, Emily sat in the quiet, her heart filled with a deep sense of peace. The world around her had changed, and though it was still unfamiliar, she had found her place within it. With Daniel by her side, she knew that no matter what the future held, she would never feel alone again. His silence spoke volumes, and in that silence, they had found a love that words could never define. As time passed, the seasons shifted, and so did Emily's understanding of the world around her. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and with it came a sense of tranquility. The life she had chosen was no longer something she merely tolerated, it was something she had come to embrace fully. Her hands had become strong, calloused from the work, but each bruise, each ache, was a testament to her growth. She had become accustomed to waking before the sun, to feeling the rhythm of the earth beneath her feet. Daniel's silent presence had transformed from something enigmatic to something deeply comforting, a constant reminder that love didn't always need to be loud to be real. Despite the peace that had settled into her life, there were moments when Emily couldn't help but think back to the world she had left behind. She thought about her father, his disappointment, his anger, and wondered if he would ever come to understand why she had chosen this life. Would he ever accept Daniel? And if he couldn't, what would that mean for her? Could she continue to live in this quiet world, knowing that part of her past would always be a shadow in the distance? One day, as Emily sat on the porch with a basket of freshly picked vegetables, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. She looked up to see Daniel walking toward her, carrying a bundle of firewood. His face was unreadable, as usual, but there was something in his demeanor that made Emily's heart skip a beat. He set the wood down beside her and knelt by the basket, his eyes meeting hers in a way that made her feel a sense of urgency, a quiet plea for something unspoken. Emily felt a rush of warmth in her chest as she looked at him. Without a word, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He opened it to a page she had never seen before, his hand slightly trembling. This wasn't the journal he had given her before, the one with his past laid bare. This was different, a page he had written for her, for this moment. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the words, carefully inscribed in the same delicate handwriting she had come to know and love. "Emily, you have changed everything for me," the note began. "You've taught me that love does not require perfection, that silence can be louder than any word. You've taught me to live again, to believe in the possibility of joy, of peace. I never thought I would feel this way again, but with you, I have found a home in my heart. And though I cannot speak, I want you to know that my love for you is as constant as the stars in the sky. It is a love without need for words, without time or place. It is the quiet promise I make to you, that I will stand by you, forever." As Emily read those words, her eyes filled with tears. She had known that Daniel loved her in his silent way, but seeing it written down, seeing the raw emotion in the lines he had penned, touched her in a way she hadn't expected. She felt a deep, overwhelming gratitude. She had found something here, something rare, something sacred, that she never thought she would have. She looked up at him, her voice thick with emotion as she whispered, "I love you too, Daniel. More than words could ever express." Daniel's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, there was something almost tender in his expression. He reached out and gently cupped her face with his hand, his touch both firm and gentle, as though grounding her in the truth of the moment. Emily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling the weight of their shared silence, and in that silence, she found everything she needed. That evening, as they sat together under a blanket of stars, Emily reflected on all that had led her to this point. She thought about her father's anger, about the judgment of the townspeople, about the doubts that had once clouded her mind. She had come so far from the life she had once known, and in doing so, she had discovered something far more valuable: peace, love, and the freedom to be herself. She no longer felt defined by her father's wealth or expectations, nor did she feel burdened by the societal pressures that had once dictated her every move. She had found a way to live in harmony with the world, and more importantly, with herself. But even as Emily embraced this new life, she knew that not everyone shared her peace. The town still whispered about her decision to marry Daniel, the mute shepherd. There were still those who would never understand. Yet Emily had learned to let go of the need for their approval. What mattered now was her own sense of fulfillment, her own happiness. And Daniel had given her the space to discover that, silently, steadfastly, and without question. Life, however, has a way of throwing challenges at you when you least expect them. Emily and Daniel had built something beautiful together, but the outside world had not forgotten them. It wasn't long before the town's whispers grew louder, reaching the ears of those who still held power over her past. One day, as they worked in the field, a group of familiar faces arrived, two of her father's most trusted associates. Their presence was unmistakable, their suits sharp against the backdrop of the rustic landscape. Emily's heart sank as she recognized the men who had been her father's loyal followers. They approached her with all the pomp and gravity that their positions demanded, their faces grim. "Miss Harrison," one of them said, his tone formal and cold. "We've come to speak with you on behalf of your father. He's not pleased with your choices and insists that you return to him immediately. The future of your family is at stake." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she met their gaze. She had known this day might come, but it didn't make it any easier. Her father's influence stretched far beyond the town. And the pressure to return to his world of luxury and power was immense. The men were insistent, their words loaded with the threat of consequences. Her father had not given up on trying to control her. They told her that her marriage to Daniel had humiliated him, that she had betrayed everything he had worked for, and that her actions were putting her family's reputation at risk. But Emily was no longer the naive young woman who had once feared her father's wrath. She had learned the value of independence, of carving her own path. She knew what her father was asking, and for the first time, she felt no hesitation in her heart. "I will not return to him," Emily said, her voice steady and firm. "I will not live my life by anyone's terms but my own." The men exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by her refusal. "You don't understand the consequences of your actions," one of them warned. "Your father has many resources. He will make sure you regret this decision." But Emily, standing tall and unwavering, replied, "I am already living with the consequences. I've chosen a life of my own, and no threat will change that." The men left soon after, their words hanging in the air like a bitter taste. But Emily's resolve only grew stronger. She had made her decision long ago, and nothing could shake her now. As she turned to Daniel, she could see the pride in his eyes. They didn't need words to understand each other. This life they had built together was more than enough. It was a life of love, of simplicity, of deep, unspoken bonds that transcended the material world. And so, Emily and Daniel continued their quiet, fulfilling life together. The world outside might never understand them, might never approve of their choices, but they had found something much more precious than approval: they had found each other. And that was enough. As the weeks stretched into months, Emily's life continued to transform in ways she hadn't expected. Each day seemed to blend into the next, but it wasn't the monotony of routine that made it feel so fulfilling, it was the sense of purpose, the quiet joy that came from living in harmony with the land, with Daniel, and with herself. The deep connection she had found with Daniel was like an unspoken language, and their bond grew stronger with every passing day. They had found something profound together, and it was all they needed. But as much as Emily had embraced this life, she knew there were forces beyond their peaceful farm that still loomed large. Her father's shadow never fully disappeared, and the wealth and influence he wielded over the town could not be easily ignored. There were whispers still circulating about her rebellion against him, about the daughter who had traded wealth for simplicity. It wasn't just gossip, it was a matter of public opinion. Emily's rejection of her father's lifestyle had made waves, and while some were quietly supportive of her choice, others were not so kind. Her decision to marry Daniel had caused a ripple that had disturbed the calm surface of the town's carefully curated social order. One day, a letter arrived at their doorstep. The neat handwriting on the envelope sent a shiver through Emily, as she recognized it immediately, her father's handwriting. She held it in her hands, the weight of the envelope pressing against her palms like a message from another life. Daniel, sensing her unease, watched silently from across the room, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling within her. He knew the significance of the letter without her saying a word. "I'm not sure I want to open it," Emily murmured, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. For so long, she had felt free from her father's influence, but now, with the letter in her hands, the reality of his presence in her life came crashing back. Daniel stood and walked toward her, his silent reassurance as comforting as ever. He took the letter from her hands, his expression unreadable, and gently tore open the envelope. The paper inside was thick, expensive, a mark of the world Emily had left behind. She braced herself as Daniel unfolded it, and as his eyes scanned the letter, Emily's breath hitched. He didn't say anything at first, but his posture told her that this letter was different from the others. It wasn't a simple demand. It was a challenge. After a long silence, Daniel handed the letter to her without a word. Emily took it from him, unfolding it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the words. "Dear Emily, I have been patient, waiting for you to come to your senses, but it seems that you are determined to squander your future. Your marriage to Daniel is an insult not only to me but to everything that our family has worked for. I have allowed you the space to live your life as you see fit, but enough is enough. If you do not return to the fold, I will be forced to take action. I will disown you. You will have no claim to the family's wealth, and you will be left with nothing. You know what you stand to lose. Don't make a decision you'll regret. Your father." The words hit Emily like a slap, each one a sharp reminder of the world she had turned her back on. She sat down on the porch, the letter heavy in her hands, as she processed the ultimatum. It wasn't the first time her father had used threats to manipulate her, but this one felt different. It wasn't just an empty threat, it was a clear warning that her choices would come at a cost. The fear and doubt crept back into her mind, but she didn't let them control her. She had already made her decision once, and she wasn't going to let this letter change that. Daniel, ever silent, sat beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions that swirled inside her. She glanced at him, her heart full of conflicting thoughts. What if this time, her father really did disown her? What would that mean for them? The reality of being cut off from everything she had known, the wealth, the privilege, the security, was something that still lingered in the back of her mind. It was easy to romanticize the life she had chosen when everything felt right, but now, with her father's words hanging over her, the reality of their situation felt more precarious. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel reached out and placed his hand on hers, a quiet gesture that spoke louder than any words could. His touch was warm, grounding, and steady. He didn't need to say anything, he simply held her hand, offering her his unwavering support. And in that moment, Emily realized something profound. She had spent so much time worrying about the future, about the consequences of her choices, that she had forgotten what truly mattered. What mattered was this moment, here, with Daniel. What mattered was the life they had built together, the love they had found in the silence, the partnership they had forged in the quiet moments of their lives. She could not let fear dictate her future. She had chosen this life because it was real, because it was hers, and she would not let anyone take that away from her. With a deep breath, Emily folded the letter and set it aside. She looked at Daniel, her eyes clear, her resolve firm. "We will stay," she said softly. "This is our life now. And nothing, not even my father, can take that away from us." Daniel's eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks, Emily saw a small smile tug at the corner of his lips. She didn't need to hear him speak to know that he agreed with her. In that moment, she understood more than ever that their bond transcended words. They were partners, in every sense of the word. They had faced challenges together, and they would continue to do so. No matter what her father threw at them, they would face it together. The days that followed were marked by a renewed sense of determination. Emily and Daniel continued their work on the farm, their lives unchanged by the threat that had loomed over them. They found solace in the rhythm of their days, in the peace they had created for themselves. But the shadow of her father's ultimatum still loomed in the back of Emily's mind, a reminder that there were battles ahead. She knew, deep down, that her father would not give up easily. He would continue to try to pull her back into his world, to tear apart the life she had built with Daniel. But Emily was no longer the woman she had been when she left his house. She had learned what it meant to live with integrity, to choose her own path, no matter the cost. And she was ready to face whatever came next. As the seasons changed once again, Emily realized that she had grown stronger in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had learned to let go of the fear that had once controlled her, and in its place, she had found a quiet confidence. The love she shared with Daniel had become her foundation, and with each passing day, she felt more rooted in the life they had created together. They had built something that no amount of wealth or power could ever take away: their love, their connection, and their unwavering commitment to each other. And though her father's threat still hung over her, Emily knew one thing for sure: she would never go back. She would never return to the life of pretense and expectations. She had found her true self in the silence of the life she shared with Daniel. And that was all she needed.